Despite potentially having the most enthusiastic spirit of adventure in all of Doctor Who, the First Doctor era is also haunted by a recurring character theme that appears to juxtapose this: a wistful yearning to belong somewhere. Let's analyse. See, a big criticism that classic Who snobs like myself tend to throw at modern Who is that it's too focused on the domestic, that every few episodes the revival feels obligated to drag us away from the endless imagination of all of time and space and bring us back down to the comforting relatability of present-day Earth, where the companion characters engage in some interpersonal drama with their loved ones and conflate their relatively ordinary home environments with the reckless, dangerous escapism they have with the Doctor. And, you know, I'm not going to completely disagree with that, because honestly I do get it to some extent. It is without a doubt modern Who's most consistent focus over the years. But at the same time, I feel like this critique tends to paint an inaccurate misconception about the show as a whole. That modern Who is the era with all the touchy-feely emotional attachment to home life almost to a fault, while classic Who was this unshackled free-for-all with little to no acknowledgement or care for the subject. No, 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 my dears. Just because classic Who didn't necessarily pop round Harry Sullivan's house every Tuesday afternoon for tea with his parents doesn't mean that classic Who didn't focus on domestic topics, whether upfront or thematically. I've discussed in previous videos how, say, the Troughton era has familial undercurrents in regards to the Doctor being a foster father to Victoria, or Jamie and Zoe having a playfully teasing sibling-like bond, but there's also the McCoy era with Ace being strongly influenced, almost haunted, by her streetwise home life experiences and traumas. Additionally, there's the soap opera-styled conflicts and shouting matches between our lead characters during the Davison and Colin Baker eras, and hell, a couple of the Pertwee era's biggest selling points are the tightly knitted unit-family dynamic and the general setup of aliens coming to Earth and into contact with contemporary everyday life, maybe even infiltrating or masquerading as everyday aspects that we take for granted. Classic Who has tons of material like this. It's just that the implementation is pretty different from that of the revival. But ultimately, all this pales in comparison to the opening years of the show. The Hartnell era is infused with consistent character themes of finding solidarity in a nomadic lifestyle and wanting to belong somewhere or to return home. The most blatant example of this, of course, is Ian and Barbara's primary motivation following their abduction by the Doctor in the show's opening episode. All they want is to go back to their own time. Two 1960s school teachers whose curiosity got the better of them, and now their only real connection to their era is each other. A sentiment which the pair of them voice in the opening episode of the original Dalek story.
I counted so much on just going back to things I recognize and trust. But here there's nothing to rely on, nothing.
Well, there's me.
It's probably a major reason as to why I'm such a big fan of stories where this early TARDIS crew gets split up. Not only does it allow opportunities for multiple plot threads concerning each lead, but it's also extremely compelling watching Ian and Barbara fight tooth and nail to get back to each other. If Barbara is the only link that Ian has to home, then he will absolutely commit himself to overcoming any obstacle which separates the two of them, and vice versa. Though they have each other, naturally they continue to hold out hope for the possibility that they will actually get back to their time someday. Hell, I lose count of the amount of times that an optimistic Ian comfortingly grabs a depressed Barbara by her biceps from behind and assures her that they'll make it back eventually. Of course, they learn to make do with the cards they're handed and try to apply a homely sensibility to their travels with the Doctor, but as Ian himself puts it in the concluding episode of The Chase,
I want to sit in a pub and drink a pint of beer again. I want to walk in a park and watch a cricket match. Above all, I want to belong somewhere, do something, instead of this aimless drifting around in space.
What they ultimately desire is stability and familiarity that a nomadic life on the TARDIS simply cannot provide. This is a couple of people who are so desperate for the conformity of their home time that they are willing to take a potentially life-threatening chance in an unreliable time machine just for the hope of getting there. Kinda thematic if you think about it. And even though they arrive 2 years out from when they left and have potentially ballsed up their careers with their unintended absence, it's fine, because compared with everything else they've been through together, it's grounded, it's safe, it's familiar. And of course, these themes don't stop there either. This desire to belong extends to other characters as well. First, there's the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan, who, when we first meet her, loves the 20th century and highly treasures her time at Coal Hill School, to the point where she passionately affirms that she'd leave the TARDIS when the Doctor states that he'd move them on to someplace new if he let Ian and Barbara go.
I won't go, Grandfather. I won't leave the 20th century. I'd rather leave the TARDIS than you.
Now you're being sentimental and childish.
No, I mean it.
See, it's a little bit of a simplification to say that the Doctor kidnaps Ian and Barbara just because they discovered his secret. He also does it because if he did let them go, he'd be compelled to move on anyway to escape the publicity, and in the process he fears he could potentially lose Susan too, and that's just not a risk that he wants to take. More on that later. So in a sense, he also somewhat forces Susan back into this wandering life against her wishes. As a result of this, throughout the rest of her tenure, Susan wistfully contemplates this fact and flirts with the idea of wanting to belong somewhere and make something of herself.
Sometimes I feel I'd like to belong somewhere, not just be a wanderer. Still, I'm not unhappy.
One day, we'll know all the mysteries of the skies. And we'll stop our wandering.
But at the same time, she also has this conflicting desire to remain loyal to her grandfather in his old age. This eventually comes to a head in the Dalek invasion of Earth when she develops feelings for a guy called David, and thus she is forced to confront this internal conflict. Either continue travelling with her grandfather and potentially never find a purpose in life, or settle down in a stable environment and establish an identity for herself.
Rebuilding a planet from the very beginning. It's a wonderful idea.
Well, you could always help.
Yes.
Now, of course, the ethics of this are up for debate, like the implied gender commentary of Susan's needs explicitly being informed by marrying a guy, or the Doctor ultimately denying her agency in resolving her own indecision. But regardless of where your stance lands on that, it's undeniable that the core of Susan's storyline is thematically domestic, a decision between family or stability. Kind of similar to the conclusion that I reached about Victoria in my video concerning her during Troughton Month, only with Susan the familial aspect is a bit more literal. The first trio of companions aren't the only ones with a domestic longing, for the record. For instance, there's Vicki, an orphaned girl on a crashed spaceship. Following the tragic circumstances of her introduction, the Doctor, Barbara and Ian decide to take her on as basically an adopted granddaughter figure following Susan's departure. Ultimately, Vicki ends up considering travelling with the Doctor to be her true calling, affirming that there's nowhere else she'd rather be.
Don't you want to go with them, child?
What for? What do I want to be back in their time for? I want to be with you. I made my decision. I wanted to stay. Anyway, I wouldn't have anything to go back to.
It's kind of an inverse of Susan's journey. Susan actively needed to leave the Doctor to find fulfillment, while Vicki conversely finds travelling with the Doctor to be the best life for her, which makes her random as hell exit in the Mythmakers extremely out of character, but whatever, can't win 'em all. Right at the end of the First Doctor's era, we also get Ben and Polly, another 1960s man-woman pairing abducted from their home time time and longing to get back to their lives, although this arc is nowhere near as prominent or desperate as that of Ian and Barbara's. It's more just a casual musing for them than anything else.
Hey, perhaps we can catch a lift back to England. 1986? Oh no, and I thought we'd be able to get home.
Yeah, we're still at sea.
Though that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's cute. Last but not least, we have the good doctor himself. Now, on a surface level, you wouldn't really expect the first Doctor to have much in the way of domestic motivations. After all, he's a citizen of the universe, tempted on and intrigued by the call of all the countless times and places he has yet to visit.
Always search for truth. My truth is in the stars.
You'd think thoughts of home and family would be at the back of his mind, but make no mistake, such themes are baked into his very core. After all, his granddaughter Susan serves as a particularly strong domestic element for the Doctor, as she brings out a rather protective, paternal, and sometimes patronising streak in his character. Stories like the Sensorites and eventually the Dalek invasion of Earth demonstrate a reluctance on the Doctor's part to let Susan grow up.
So I'm to be treated like a silly little child.
If you behave like one, yes.
And again, the ethical implications of his treatment of Susan are a hot-button topic up for debate, but clearly he has a strong emotional attachment to this kind of patriarchal familial bond, making his eventual decision to give her up a pretty pivotal moment for him. Obviously, he still remains fond of that kind of paternal relationship, hence why he's open to taking Vicki under his wing as effectively a substitute granddaughter, but he also ends up being a lot warmer and much less domineering towards her as a result of learning to let Susan go. A similar case happens with Dodo. Hell, he makes a direct connection there, taking a liking to her because she looks like Susan.
Don't you think she looks rather like my grandchild Susan?
But in terms of their actual interpersonal relationship, it's comparatively far more detached. So yeah, the First Doctor may be an enigmatic adventurer eager to explore the cosmos, but a homely family bond is still undeniably important to him. And sometimes, even he showcases a homesick longing from time to time. As immediately as the show's very first episode, he makes a reference to his and Susan's situation as homeless, isolated wanderers, and he aloofly acknowledges the eventuality of their return to their civilization.
Susan and I are cut off from our own planet, without friends or protection. But one day, we shall get back. Yes, one day.
And a similar moment occurs in the Season 3 serial The Massacre, when Stephen, temporarily, storms out of the TARDIS and the First Doctor arguably has his lowest emotional moment, fearing that he's finally become truly alone in his travels, and contemplating if this is an indication that he should now return to his planet, and he seems to emotionally break down upon rejecting the idea.
Perhaps I should go home, back to my own planet. But I can't.
It's honestly extremely fascinating watching the First Doctor react to the possibility of travelling alone. It's almost the kind of angst you'd expect decades later from the Tennant or Smith eras of modern Who. It's a great, powerful moment. That said, as strong as all this is, I think Season 3 is where these homely themes begin to waver a lot. After all, I already mentioned Vicki's out-of-character exit, but additionally, the Doctor and Dodo's relationship ends up not being particularly familial for the most part. Dodo casually flat-out disregards her home life, Stephen isn't exactly heavily motivated by domestic attributes himself, and with the Doctor's diminishing presence in the later stories, his paternal side and his musings on his nomadic life begin to fade into the background. But still, the season does end with the present-day Earth-based serial, The War Machines, brimming with contemporary swinging 60s culture and effectively setting the template for later stories where the Doctor would work with the military, so even towards the end, this era was continuing to present us with different flavours of home life. That's neat. But yeah, I just felt like this was an interesting topic to delve into. The wanderers of the fourth dimension, who deep down were truly longing for home. Bye.